The most feared man in Seoul had one rule above all others: never let anyone become necessary. And he had kept that rule for 15 years through blood and betrayal and every kind of loss, until a 50-year-old woman from DC got on her knees to clean his floors, and he felt something crack open in his chest that no amount of control could close. He said, "I crave you," like it was being pulled out of him against his will, and Mirabelle froze because she had spent the last 2 years being told she was not enough, not young enough, not fertile enough, not worth staying for. But somewhere in Seoul's shadows, enemies had already noticed the way Lee Ji-hyun watched her, and they were about to use it to burn everything down. Welcome to Black and Soul TV. Please like, share, and subscribe. Mirabelle Clark had not planned on South Korea. She had not planned on any of this. 6 months ago, she had been sitting in a lawyer's office in Washington, D.C., in the same blazer she had worn to her own wedding 22 years earlier, listening to a man she had loved since she was 28 explain in measured legal language that he was ending their marriage because she could not give him children. Not because she had not wanted to. Not because she had refused. Because of an infection she had suffered at 19, reckless and young and unaware of the price her body would one day be asked to pay. The doctors had told her in her early 30s. She had told David. He had said it did not matter. For 14 years he had said it did not matter. And then one Tuesday in March he had come home with papers already signed and a new apartment already leased and a woman already waiting, younger, with a different future ahead of her. And Mirabelle had sat across from him in that lawyer's office and understood that she had been measuring love with the wrong instrument her entire life. She had not cried in the office. She had not cried at the courthouse. She had cried once, alone in the parking garage on a Thursday afternoon with her forehead pressed against the steering wheel of a car that would be repossessed 4 months later. And then she had sealed it away because she had always been better at surviving than she was at falling apart. The debt had come next, quietly at first, and then all at once the way disasters always do. The mortgage she had taken in her name. The credit lines that had kept them comfortable through David's career transitions. The savings account that turned out to be mostly his. By November, she had been sleeping on her older sister's couch in Alexandria, sending out applications with the same competence and desperation, watching her sister try not to look at her with too much pity. The Seoul posting had appeared on an international domestic placement site at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. Live-in position, top-tier residence. Salary 3 times anything available in D.C. She had applied before she finished reading the full description. The agency coordinator was a brisk Korean woman named Ms. Park who conducted the intake interview over video call and explained the position in the tone of someone who had given this speech many times and preferred not to repeat herself. The residence belongs to Mr. Lee Ji-hyun, Ms. Park said. He is a private individual with very specific expectations. Discretion is not optional. You will maintain the penthouse, manage restocking, oversee scheduling for household deliveries, and you will not ask questions about his business or his visitors. Mirabelle had nodded professionally and asked nothing. She had flown to Seoul 9 days later with 2 checked bags, a carry-on, and the particular freedom that comes from having nothing left to protect. The building in Gangnam was not what she had expected. It was not a building so much as a statement, a glass tower that caught the Han River light at dusk and held it like something it had stolen. The lobby had the hushed, pressurized quiet of a place where important things happened behind closed doors. A building manager named Mr. Cho walked her through the private elevator code and the household protocols without making eye contact. The penthouse occupies the full upper floor, he said. Mr. Lee does not entertain guests in the traditional sense. You will not disturb him when his office doors are closed. You will not speak to anyone who enters about what you observe. Mirabelle understood. She had spent 2 decades making herself easy to overlook. Invisible was a language she already spoke fluently. The penthouse was enormous and immaculate, and utterly without warmth. She walked through it alone that first evening after Mr. Cho left, trailing her fingers along surfaces that gleamed like they had never been touched. The kitchen had professional-grade appliances that showed no evidence of use. The living room held furniture chosen for elegance rather than comfort. The walls displayed art she did not recognize, but recognized as expensive. Everything about the space said power and said it quietly, the way truly dangerous things rarely need to announce themselves. She found one small imperfection near the kitchen counter. A single glass, half full of water, sitting at the edge of the marble like it had been set down by someone in the middle of a thought they had not finished. Something about that ordinary detail in the middle of all that controlled perfection made her chest tighten in a way she chose not to examine. She started the next morning at 6, methodical and thorough, beginning with the entry corridor and working her way through. She had been scrubbing the marble entryway floor on her hands and knees for 20 minutes when the private elevator opened behind her and the air in the room changed. She felt him before she saw him. The particular quality of silence that fills a space when someone powerful enters it, the way everything seems to recalibrate toward a new center. She turned, still on her knees with the cleaning cloth in her hand, and Lee Ji-hyun walked into his penthouse and stopped. He was not what the file photo had prepared her for. The photo had shown a composed man in a dark suit at some formal event, handsome in a distant, architectural way. In person, he was something else entirely. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in all black despite the early hour, with a face that carried the particular stillness of someone who had learned to show nothing because showing something once had cost him. He looked at her, and the stillness broke just slightly, a fraction of something moving behind his eyes that she caught before he replaced it with nothing. She started to stand. He said, in English that carried only the faintest edge of accent, "Do not stop on my account." She stopped anyway, because her knees had decided they were done cooperating, and pushed herself upright with what dignity the situation allowed. "I am Mirabelle Clark," she said, "the new household manager. Ms. Park's agency." "I know who you are," he said. He was still looking at her in that way that she could not quite categorize. Not rude, not flirtatious. Something more unsettling than either. Like he was trying to determine something and had not yet reached a conclusion. He moved past her into the kitchen and poured water from a pitcher in the refrigerator and drank it standing at the counter. She went back to her work. A second chance was given to Mirabelle, to start life afresh, to make something for herself, to find peace. But as Lee Ji-hyun walked in, something sparked. Can a 50-year-old find love again? Or is fate playing tricks on her? Hit that subscribe button, let's find out. He did not speak again before he disappeared behind the closed doors of his home office. But she could feel, for the rest of that morning, the particular weight of someone paying attention. She told herself it was nothing. She was 50 years old. She had been invisible for so long that being looked at felt like an error. She went back to her schedule and kept her eyes on her work and reminded herself why she was in Seoul and what she needed from this job and how much everything in her life depended on her not being foolish. It worked for approximately 3 days. By the end of the first week, she had developed an understanding of his rhythms. He rose early, always before her. He worked through most of the day behind closed doors. He ate sparingly and without apparent enjoyment. The way someone eats when food is fuel and pleasure is something they have stopped making room for. He came and went at strange hours, sometimes returning well past midnight, and sometimes not at all, and she learned not to ask about the nights he did not come back, because the men who arrived occasionally at the private elevator entrance had the kind of eyes that answered questions before you finished asking them. He was Lee Ji-hyun. She already knew what that name meant in Seoul even before her sister's husband, who had spent time in Korea for business, had called her the night before her flight and said, "Mirabelle, do you know who you are going to work for?" She had said yes. He had said be careful. She had been careful her whole life, and it had not saved her from anything. What she had not expected was the small things. The way he set the coffee machine to brew at 6:15 each morning, her preferred time, after observing her schedule for exactly 2 days without saying a word. The way a grocery order appeared one afternoon that included the specific brand of tea she had mentioned to no one, had simply moved to the back of the pantry shelf because she missed it from home. The way he paused, one evening when she was in the kitchen after hours finishing inventory, and set a takeout container on the counter beside her without comment, and said only, "You have not eaten today," and walked away before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen holding a container of jjigae she had not asked for, and felt something in her chest do something she had specifically told it not to do. Later that night, she ate it at the kitchen counter in the dark, alone, and stared out at the city and told herself this was professional consideration and nothing more. He was meticulous about his environment. She was part of his environment. That was all this was. She almost believed it. The complication arrived on a Tuesday in her third week in the form of a man named Kim Seon-woo, who appeared at the penthouse around noon while Lee Ji-hyun was away. He was one of Ji-hyun's associates, or that was what she understood him to be, mid-30s, handsome in an obvious way, and the kind of man who treated every woman he encountered as an audience that had arrived specifically for him. He complimented her appearance with a casual presumption of someone who expected gratitude for the attention. He leaned against the kitchen counter while she was working and made conversation she had not invited and let his eyes travel in directions she did not appreciate. She kept her responses short and her posture closed and focused on her work with the concentrated patience of a woman who had dealt with far worse. She did not know that Ji-hyun had returned early and was standing in the hallway entrance until she turned to retrieve something from the supply cabinet and found him there. His face was completely still. His eyes were on Kim Se-woo. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees with no weather explanation. Kim Se-woo straightened up immediately and stopped speaking mid-sentence. Ji-hyun said nothing to him in that moment. He walked to the kitchen counter, positioned himself with a naturalness that was somehow entirely deliberate at Mirabelle's side, and said to her in a tone so calm, it was almost frightening, "Is there anything you need?" She blinked. "No, thank you." He looked at Kim Se-woo then, and whatever passed between them in that look, silent and absolute, sent the other man out of the kitchen within 30 seconds with a suddenly remembered appointment elsewhere in the building. Ji-hyun watched him go. Then he turned back to the counter and poured himself water and said nothing further, as though none of it had happened. Mirabelle stood very still and felt something electric move through the air between them that had no reasonable explanation. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Don't thank me," he said. Then he took his water and left the kitchen, and she stood there alone for a full minute before she could make her hands start working again. A few days later, she made the mistake of asking him how he took his coffee. She had been managing the household for nearly a month and had been preparing his coffee according to the machine's preset, which produced something black and strong, and she had never asked because she had assumed he preferred it that way, but she had noticed he occasionally left it half-finished, and she asked because she was thorough and because it was part of her job and for absolutely no other reason. He looked at her from across the kitchen counter for a moment that stretched slightly past normal. "A little milk," he said. "No sugar." She nodded and adjusted it the next morning. He drank the entire cup. He said nothing about it. But she caught him looking at her when she returned to clear the cup away, and his expression had something in it she could not name, open and carefully covered at the same time, like a door that had been blown briefly ajar and immediately pressed shut. She went to her room that evening and sat on the edge of her bed and had a very firm conversation with herself about the difference between warmth and foolishness, between being seen and being wanted, between a man who showed consideration because he valued his environment and one who meant something by it. She had been down the road of believing a man's attention meant his heart was following. She knew where that road ended. She was sleeping in Seoul on a work visa because of exactly that mistake. She was not going to make it again. She was not going to let herself feel anything for a man who occupied a world built on violence and danger and rules she did not understand, and who could replace her with a phone call and never think of her again. She was not going to do it. She was resolved. She was absolutely certain. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. The night it all shifted was a Thursday, 6 weeks into her posting. She had been working late reorganizing the household inventory, a task that required access to the storage rooms off the main corridor, and she had not heard him come home. She was carrying an overfull box of replacement linens from the back corridor toward the linen closet when she rounded the corner and walked directly into Lee Ji-hyun's chest. The box went sideways. He caught it with one hand and caught her elbow with the other, and for one suspended moment they were standing close enough that she could see the details of his face that distance usually erased, a scar along his jaw she had never noticed, the exhaustion living beneath the controlled surface of his expression, and something else, something raw and unguarded that appeared for half a second before he could arrange his face back into composure. He did not step back immediately. Neither did she. The linens were on the floor. His hand was on her elbow. The hallway was very quiet. "You work too late," he said. His voice was low and closer than she was accustomed to hearing it. "Someone has to," she said, and was immediately surprised by her own tone, dry and almost easy, the voice of a woman who had not entirely lost herself yet. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough that it reached his eyes. He bent and picked up the fallen linens, handing them back to her with a care that was completely unnecessary for the task, and she took them and thanked him and walked the rest of the way to the linen closet with her pulse, doing something entirely unprofessional. She heard him in the kitchen that night long after she should have been asleep. She lay in her small staff room and listened to the sound of movement and the distant sound of water running and told herself to stay in bed. She got up, put on her robe, and found him standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water and his jacket off, and his sleeves rolled up, and he looked at her when she appeared in the doorway with an expression that was simply tired and real in a way that none of his other expressions had been. She made tea. She did not ask if he wanted any. She just made 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat at the counter across from him with hers. And for a while neither of them said anything. He told her eventually, in pieces, the way a person who has forgotten how to talk about themselves begins to remember, that he had been running his family's organization since he was 26 because there was no one else, that his father had built something terrible and then died before he could dismantle it, that he had spent 15 years being the thing the organization needed him to be and could not remember any more what he had wanted before that. He said it without self-pity, just as fact, the way people report weather. She told him about the infection, about David, about the divorce, about the couch in Alexandria and the repossessed car and the soul posting she had taken because it was the only door left open. She said it cleanly, without performance, because she was too tired for anything else, and because something in the quality of his listening made honesty feel less dangerous than it usually did. Lee Ji-hyun uncovers her awful past, the reason why no one wants her. Will he abandon her like the rest? Or will he stay despite all odds? Hit that subscribe button, and let's see if Mirabelle deserves to be loved again. You should not blame yourself for your body, he said. She looked at him. No one had ever said that to her before. Not once. Not her sister, not her friends, not even her therapist who was supposed to be paid to say useful things. She looked down at her tea and pressed her lips together and did not cry, but it was close. She felt him watching her with that quality of attention that was different from how anyone else paid attention, focused and still and entirely present, and she kept her eyes down until she trusted her face again. You are not invisible, he said quietly. Whatever you have been told, or whatever you have told yourself, you are not invisible. She looked up at him. The kitchen was dim. The city blazed below the windows. He was looking at her the way no one had looked at her in a very long time, like she was worth looking at, like looking at her was not something he was willing to stop. She stood up, took her cup to the sink, rinsed it with hands that were not entirely steady, and said good night without turning around. She walked back to her room and closed the door and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and pressed her hands against her face and understood, with the full miserable clarity of a woman who had tried very hard to prevent exactly this, that she was in serious trouble. The next morning she was professional and efficient and kept her eyes on her work. He was the same. The kitchen conversation might not have happened. She was grateful for that. She told herself she was grateful. A few days later, she overheard parts of a meeting through the closed office doors, voices raised, names she did not recognize, the particular tension of men discussing things that had consequences. When he emerged in the late afternoon, his jaw was set, and his eyes were hard, and he moved through the apartment with the clipped efficiency of someone containing something large. She was in the living room returning art books to a shelf when he stopped near her, not close, but close enough, and she looked at him and said nothing, and he stood there for a moment and then said, "There is a situation developing. You should stay in the building this week." She set the book down. "Is that a request or a requirement?" He looked at her. "Please," he said, and the word in his mouth was in used sounding, like something he did not say often and meant when he did. She stayed. The situation, she gathered from fragments over the following days, involved a rival organization pressing into Ji-hyun's territory with methods that were not subtle. She saw more of his men moving through the lobby. She saw him leave late and return later. She saw exhaustion accumulate in his face and noticed that he ate even less than usual, and one evening, she made rice and vegetables and set a plate outside his office door and knocked once and walked away. And when she passed the door an hour later, the plate was empty, and she did not say anything about it, and neither did he. By the end of that week, something had shifted between them with neither of them addressing it. A kind of acknowledgement without words, the specific intimacy of two people who have begun to arrange themselves around each other without having agreed to. The evening it broke open began with a dinner. He had asked her, through a formal request she found on the kitchen counter on a note card, whether she would be willing to accompany him to a professional function as his guest, not his staff. He had written, underlining it once. The function required a guest. He did not explain further. She stood in the kitchen holding the note card for a long time. She went. She wore a dress she had brought from DC that she had never expected to wear again. Deep green, fitted, and she stood in front of the small mirror in her staff bathroom and looked at herself critically, at the softness of her figure and the gray threading through her natural hair and the lines that lived at the corners of her eyes. And then she lifted her chin and walked out. He was waiting in the living room in a dark suit, and when she appeared in the doorway, he went completely still. The look on his face was brief and total, and he replaced it quickly, but she had seen it, and her whole body registered it before her mind could issue instructions to the contrary. "You look," he said, and paused, and said simply beautiful. She almost said something dismissive. She caught it. She said thank you and meant it. The function was elegant and attended by people who moved with the precise ease of those who had never worried about money or safety. She did not know most of what was being discussed in the conversations around her, the industry language and the Korean she was not fluent in, but she was not uncomfortable. She had spent years in DC rooms full of people who assumed she was less than she was, and she had learned to occupy space with a quality of self-possession that had nothing to do with who was watching. She answered questions directly. She made two people laugh. She held her own. He watched her the entire evening. She felt it, even when her back was turned, that specific weight of his attention. When a man she did not know, tall and polished and smiling too freely, spent 20 minutes near her being charming in a way that was not subtle, she was aware of Ji-hyun across the room going very still in a way that she was beginning to recognize as dangerous. On the drive home, he said nothing for the first 10 minutes. Then he said, "That man at the reception. Kim Tae-jin. He has a reputation." "I am aware," she said mildly. "I handled it." He was quiet again. Then, "I know you did." His voice was careful and controlled, and beneath it was something tightly wound. "You did not need me." She turned to look at him in the dark of the car. "No," she said, "but it would have been all right if I had." He looked at the road ahead, and his hands on the wheel tightened once, and then released. They arrived back at the penthouse in silence. In the elevator, he was standing close in the way of the small space, and she could feel the warmth of him and the particular tension he was carrying, and the elevator was very quiet. She looked at the doors. He looked at the doors. The elevator reached the top floor and opened, and neither of them moved for exactly 2 seconds. She stepped out. He followed. They stood in the entry, and the city spread out below the windows, and the apartment was very still. "Ji-hyun," she said, because she needed to say something before the silence became irreversible. He turned to her. He was looking at her with his face completely open, all the controls set down for once, and it was extraordinary and frightening, and she could not look away. "I am trying," he said quietly, "not to do something that will make you leave." She felt the words in her sternum. She took one step toward him. He took one step toward her. The distance between them closed with the specific gravity of two people who have been pretending for too long that they did not want to be near each other. He touched her face with the palm of his hand, slowly, like she was something he was asking permission from. She covered his hand with hers and held it there. What they did next belongs only to them, and the night swallowed it in the way of things that matter more than words can hold. She woke before dawn in the enormous quiet of his bedroom, and the full weight of what had happened settled over her immediately. She lay still for a moment and listened to his breathing beside her and felt the warmth of him. And then, slowly, the old fear came. The David fear. The "you will not be enough" fear. The "he will look at you in daylight and remember what you cannot give" fear. It came in and filled her chest with cold, and she was moving before she fully decided to move. Gathering herself quietly, retreating to her own room in the early dark, sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap and her heart somewhere outside her body. She was at work before 7. She was thorough and efficient and did not meet his eyes when he appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:30 and stood there looking at her with an expression she could not bear to look at directly. "Mirabelle," he said. "The coffee is ready," she said. "I need to do the west bathroom before 9. She did not give him time to say what he was clearly trying to say. She moved through the apartment with focused purpose and avoided him with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had survived things by keeping her feet moving. And by noon she had constructed something that felt almost like normal except for the particular ache that lived just below her ribs and refused to resolve. That afternoon his phone rang in the kitchen and she heard his voice change, the way it did when the call was not about business in the usual sense, lower and harder, and she heard him say her name once, and then the line cut. He appeared in the kitchen 2 minutes later. His face was the hard face, the one she had learned meant something serious was coming. "There is a problem," he said. "Someone has identified you as significant to me. The Kim faction. They know you are here." She set down what she was holding. What does that mean? It means you need to move. Tonight. There is a secure property in Itaewon that my people maintain. You will go there with an escort until this is resolved. She looked at him. And you? He held her gaze. I will handle it. She should have said fine. She should have packed a bag and gone where she was told and let the professionals manage whatever was coming. Instead, she said, I am not going anywhere while you are here dealing with something that became dangerous because of me. His expression shifted. You are not the cause of this. I am connected to it. She crossed her arms. I am not decorating a safe house while you sort it out alone. Something moved in his face that was complicated and warm and thoroughly inconvenient for both of them. You are the most stubborn woman I have ever encountered, he said. You have not been in enough rooms with black women from DC, she said. He almost smiled. Almost. Then he said, please. Quietly. The way he had said it before. The word that sounded unaccustomed in his mouth and meant everything because of it. She went. She hated going, but she went. The property in Itaewon was secure and comfortable and staffed by people who were professional and protective and completely humorless. And she spent 48 hours there with her phone, her books, and the particular agony of having no information. He sent brief messages. Situation is being managed. Are you comfortable? Do you need anything? She responded with single-word answers because anything more felt like too much. She lay awake the second night staring at the ceiling of a room that was not hers and thought about all the ways this ended badly. Because she was Mirabelle Clark from Washington, D.C., who had trusted the permanence of love once and been wrong in a way that had cost her everything. And Lee Ji-hyun was a man who ran an empire built on things she did not understand and owed her nothing and would continue living his life exactly as it had been before she walked through his elevator doors, and she was 50 years old and she knew better. She knew better. She repeated it until she almost believed it. He came for her himself on the third night. She heard the car in the driveway and assumed it was a rotation of the escort detail and was already in her robe with a book when the door opened and he walked in, dark-coated, sharp-eyed, and looking at her like the last 72 hours had been a specific kind of difficult that had nothing to do with whatever business he had been managing. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him from the chair, and he said nothing for a moment. Just looked at her with that open, unguarded expression she was starting to recognize as the truest version of his face. It is done, he said. The Kim faction has been handled. You can come back. She set the book down. She looked at her hands. I am not sure that is a good idea. He went still. Tell me why. Because I am a 50-year-old maid from DC who is in debt and on a work visa, and I do not belong in your world, and I am very aware of that even when it is easy to forget. And sooner or later you will remember it too. He crouched down in front of her chair, slowly, like she was someone who needed to be approached carefully. He waited until she looked at him. His eyes were steady and dark and completely certain. You are not a maid, he said. You are a woman who came to a strange country with nothing and rebuilt herself while managing my household and my moods and the constant difficulty of my life with more grace than I deserved. You are the person I tell things to. You are the person I think about. You are the person who made that penthouse feel, for the first time in 15 years, like somewhere I actually want to be. He paused. I am aware of your visa status. I am aware of the debt. I am aware that you came here because you had nowhere else to go. None of that is who you are to me. He took her hand, both of his hands around one of hers, holding it carefully. I am asking you to come back. Not as my household manager. I am asking you to come back as mine. She looked at him for a long time. The old fear was still there. It was always going to be there. But it was smaller now than the other thing. The thing that had been growing since a glass half full of water on a marble counter, since a cup of tea in a dark kitchen, since a man who had never been asked to say please said it to her twice, and meant it both times. You are a dangerous man, she said. Yes, your world has already tried to kill me once. It will never have the chance again. You cannot promise that. His grip on her hand tightened gently. Watch me. She looked at him. He looked back. The room was very quiet, and the city was distant outside, and something old and frightened in her chest loosened its grip by degrees. All right, she said. He closed his eyes for one moment, briefly, like a man receiving news he had been dreading might not come. Then he opened them, and they were warm in a way she had only seen glimpses of before, full and certain and directed entirely at her. They returned to the penthouse together. The weeks that followed were different. She was still thorough. She still made coffee with a little milk and no sugar and kept the household running with the precision that had always been her professional signature. But now he came and sat at the kitchen counter while she worked in the mornings, coffee between his hands, talking about nothing important and everything real, and she talked back. And the apartment filled slowly with the particular warmth of two people choosing each other inside an ordinary routine. His mother appeared one evening without announcement. A small, fierce woman named Park Yeon-hee, who assessed Mirabelle in the doorway with the specific energy of a woman who had spent a lifetime protecting something precious and was not yet convinced this newcomer was not a threat. She said several things in Korean that Ji-hyun translated with careful selectivity. Mirabelle responded in English with the same quiet authority she had brought to every difficult room in her life, direct and undefensive, and something in the older woman's assessment shifted slightly. She was not warm, but she was watching. Later, when his mother had gone and they were sitting in the living room in the comfortable silence they had built between them, he said, "She is not easy to win over." Mirabelle looked at him. "Neither am I," she said. He smiled then, fully, the kind of smile she suspected very few people had ever seen from him, and she felt it somewhere she was done pretending she didn't. The danger did not disappear. It was not that kind of life, and she was not that kind of fool. There were nights he came home with his jaw set and his eyes hard, and she learned to read which kind of hard it was, the kind that needed space and the kind that needed her nearby, and she learned to give him whichever one he needed without asking him to translate himself. He learned to tell her more than he had intended, in pieces, over time, about the weight of running something he had inherited rather than chosen, and she learned to listen without flinching, which was its own kind of bravery. Kim Seon-woo made one more appearance, arriving uninvited at the penthouse with the particular confidence of a man who had not yet understood that certain things had changed. He found Mirabelle in the kitchen and began a sentence that ended abruptly when Ji-hyun walked in, and the look on Ji-hyun's face closed the sentence permanently. What was said after Mirabelle left the room she did not know, but Kim Seon-woo did not come to the penthouse again. She did not ask Ji-hyun about it. He did not explain. She caught him watching her later that evening with that expression she had learned to read, possessive and heated, and trying to be subtle about both. And she looked at him levelly and said, "You do not have to do that, you know." "What?" he said. "Protect your territory," she said mildly. He held her gaze. "You are not my territory," he said. Then, quietly, "You are my reason." She turned back to what she was doing and kept her face composed with enormous effort. The proposal came on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, which was where most of the important things between them had happened. She was making coffee. He was sitting at the counter. He set a small box on the marble beside her coffee cup and said nothing. She looked at the box. She looked at him. He was watching her with a steadiness that held no performance in it, just honesty, the particular honesty of someone who had decided what they wanted and was done pretending otherwise. She opened the box. The ring inside was simple and beautiful and clearly chosen rather than merely expensive. "I am not asking you to disappear into my world," he said. "I am asking you to build something in it that is yours as much as mine. I know what you left behind. I know what it cost you. I know you came here with nothing and made yourself whole anyway, on your own, and that is the most extraordinary thing I have ever watched anyone do." He paused. "I want to spend the rest of my life watching you, and I want to stop watching from a distance." She stood with the ring in her hand and the coffee going untouched and the city spread out below the windows and thought about the girl who had been 19 and reckless and had not known the cost, and the woman who had been told she was not enough, and the 50-year-old who had arrived in Seoul with 2 bags and $37 and no reason to believe in anything she couldn't manage alone. She thought about what it was to be seen. She looked at Lee Ji-hyun, who was dangerous and difficult, and had said please to her twice and meant it, and had replaced her terrible coffee and set takeout beside her in the dark and crouched on the floor of a safe house to tell her what she was to him, and was looking at her now with everything he had in his face and none of it hidden. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger and stood and held her face in both his hands, and she let him, which was its own kind of answer, and outside the windows Seoul poured on in all its complicated, brilliant life below them. They married quietly, 3 months later, in a small ceremony with a handful of people who mattered. His mother sat in the front row and did not smile, but pressed Mirabelle's hand briefly before the ceremony began, and Mirabelle accepted it for what it was, which was more than formality and less than ease and exactly honest. 6 months after the wedding, on a Thursday morning, Mirabelle stood in the bathroom of the penthouse that was now her home and looked at a test in her hand and felt the world rearrange itself completely and silently around her. The infection had been severe, but not total. The doctors had said unlikely, not impossible. She walked out of the bathroom to find Ji-hyun in the kitchen, coffee made the way she liked it, waiting for her, because he always seemed to know when she was moving toward him before she arrived. She set the test on the counter in front of him and watched his face go very still and then come apart completely, slowly, in the specific way of a man receiving something he had been afraid to want. He looked at her, and his eyes were wet, and he said nothing for a long moment, and then said, Mirabelle. Just her name. The way he said it, low and wrecked and reverent, carried everything she needed to hear. She had come to Seoul with nothing. She had arrived invisible, in debt, divorced, and done with love. She had gotten on her knees to scrub a cold marble floor, and a shadow had fallen over her, and a word had escaped from a man who had not meant to say it, and the word was craving, and it had been the beginning of everything. She had not planned on South Korea. She had not planned on any of this. But standing in the kitchen of her penthouse with the morning light coming through the windows, and Lee Ji-hyun's hands on her face, and a future growing between them that had once seemed medically improbable and now felt like the most certain thing she had ever held, Mirabelle Clark understood something she had been circling her entire life. Surviving was something she had always been good at. But this was living. And she was finally, fully, irrevocably in it. If you enjoyed the story, hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for more.